Hello, I'm Geoffrey Clements. I'm the Chairman of Commonwealth Infrastructure Partners. In this presentation, I will be giving an introduction to public-private partnerships, why they're important and why they've been introduced. We'll consider their main benefits and how they are applied. Public-private partnership projects, or PPP projects, involve the participation of the private sector, that means companies and finance institutions, in large development projects that were previously conducted just by the public sector, in other words, government departments and agencies. They've been increasingly used since their introduction in the UK in the early 1990s. They have a number of potential benefits, and we'll be talking about those, but also importantly, there are some potential disadvantages and also risks involved. And so the important thing is that a PPP project has to be designed very carefully, and it has to be implemented and managed equally carefully in order to reap the potential benefits. PPP projects have particular significance in India. India has seen significant economic growth over the past few years. Infrastructure development is very important for the continued development of the economy. Without good, consistent growth of infrastructure, the growth of the economy will stall. And economy, infrastructure development are very closely interdependent factors in the growth of any country. Now, there are two main categories of infrastructure. We have economic infrastructure, which includes sectors such as roads, railways, power, ports and airports, and social infrastructure, which includes healthcare, education and social welfare. And PPP projects have been developed for both sectors, both categories of infrastructure, economic and social infrastructure. We'll see that there are a number of ways in which PPP can be implemented according to the sector, according to the type of project, and according to where it's being implemented. One simple example is toll roads for the development of highways. And this is an example where the end user pays. So every time a road user uses a particular highway, they pay a toll, which means that the more that they use that facility, the more that they pay. Public-private partnership projects are public sector projects where some elements are taken over by the private sector. And there's quite a substantial range in which the private sector can become involved in these large development projects. It can be in some cases that the private sector takes on a single element of the project, or it may take on a number of elements in some combination. And these can include, for example, the design of the project, a consultancy role, the financing of a project, actually building or constructing the project, the management, the leasing of certain facilities and assets, and the operation of the project. There are a number of important reasons why PPP projects have been introduced and why they have become increasingly popular over the past 30 years. One reason is efficiency. Government departments are notorious at being inefficient in delivering projects, and private sector companies should have greater efficiency in delivering the projects in the sectors in which they are competent. This means that projects would be higher in quality and also lower in cost. Another reason is to fill what is called the viability gap. The development of infrastructure has become increasingly expensive, and the national budget is very often inadequate to fulfill the necessary requirements for infrastructure development. By introducing the private sector, this also introduces additional sources of funding. But of course the project must be designed and implemented in an appropriate manner in order for those benefits to be experienced. Another advantage, another benefit of PPP projects is that it introduces industry best practice for that sector. So whether it's for the construction of highways or railways, the development of airports, or in the power sector, industry will have developed best practice in that sector. And by implementing projects via PPP, then those projects, which are national projects, are important, implemented by the government, can take advantage of best practice of the private sector. But also increasingly important is that they can take advantage of international best practice. As infrastructure projects become larger and as they become more and more sophisticated, it is usually the case that international partners will be involved, either as consultants or contractors or as sources of funding, which means that projects in a number of countries can take advantage of what is international best practice in the countries where those projects have been implemented in the most effective way. Another advantage of PPP projects is that risk is transferred. Now, every project will have risks in many aspects of design and implementation. Government departments are not necessarily, and usually are not, the best party to take on risks in the development and implementation of these projects. Whereas the private sector and private sources of funding will have experience in those sectors and will therefore have a better methodology for taking care of risks in a more effective way. I'll give you an example. If we're looking at the construction of a highway, there will be risks involved in every element of the design and implementation and operation of that highway. Some of those risks will be better taken care of by the government department. So a national ministry may be responsible for developing the highway. They will be best able to negotiate with local governments and landowners to acquire the land that is necessary to develop the highway. The private sector would not have the necessary competence or authority to do that. So the risk of land acquisition is taken on by the government department. Now, the actual construction of the highway, all of the surveying, the modality of building the highway, the materials that are used, all of the elements involved in the actual construction, the private sector company is best able to take on those risks. So in a public-private partnership, the public sector organisation will take on the risks that it is best able to handle, and the private sector company and perhaps subcontractors will take on the risks that they are best able to handle. So in principle at least, risks will be minimised and the parties involved in the development of the project will be best able to mitigate any risks that are eventuated. The factors that I've just considered can be summarised by saying that you're involving the private sector in national infrastructure projects. The traditional methods of procurement are a government department will design a project and then it will procure certain services from the private sector. But the private sector is not really intimately involved in either the design or the execution or the operation of that project. By implementing the project through a PPP model, it means that the private sector becomes involved. It is motivated to do well, and therefore the delivery, efficiency, effectiveness, and cost-effectiveness of the project will be better. Very often, moves towards PPP projects will be in accordance with government policy, a move from public sector ownership and operation to private sector ownership and delivery of services and the provision of infrastructure. We're going to consider the potential benefits of PPP, and in fact these benefits have been realised in the implementation of PPP projects around the world. One benefit is that there is a reduced burden of public administration. As infrastructure projects have become more complex, they've required more use of advanced technology, they've become more expensive, then that would place an increased burden on government departments if the projects are designed and implemented solely by a government department. Whereas if a PPP model is introduced, then much of that burden is taken over by the private sector, by the company. And this then reduces also the cost of public services to the taxpayer. Another benefit is that there will be better quality of service and better quality of infrastructure because specialists from the private sector companies are involved in the design, implementation and operation of the projects. The same applies to management systems, that private sector companies will, generally speaking, have better management systems than are usually available in the public sector. And as we've mentioned earlier, because many companies have international partners or are part of an international conglomerate, then projects in any country can have better access to international best practice. On the other hand, there are some potential disadvantages, and these have to be carefully considered by a government in considering whether projects should be implemented through public-private partnerships. And in some countries this may be a very sensitive issue, that the public may be allergic to certain vital public services and amenities having some element of control and operation by the private sector. So loss of control or decreased control of these public services and amenities by the government and therefore by the taxpayer may be something that is either an actual disadvantage or perceived to be a disadvantage. Another disadvantage, which is a risk, is that if the private sector company is taken over by another company or there's a change of ownership of that organisation, who will take responsibility for any errors or project failures? Will it be the previous ownership, the previous management, or will responsibility for those failures be taken on by the new ownership? This brings in an important factor, that the legal complexities of public-private partnerships have to be considered very carefully to make sure that there is no liability that falls into any gap. So increased legal complexity to deal with problems is something that has to be very carefully considered, and in the past few decades, legal professionals who are expert in PPP, this is developed as a very significant specialisation in the legal professions. Another disadvantage, and this is something where there is very often a criticism of PPP projects, is that private sector organisations, companies, potentially should be more efficient in the delivery of a project, but they are driven by a profit motive, which means that a national project, a nationally important project, is being operated by a company who are paying dividends to their shareholders. And of course, the directors of a company have corporate responsibility to their shareholders to maximise profit. And therefore, there is a potential conflict of interest in the design and implementation of a project between the factors that would be important as a public service delivery and in the operation of a company. They may also be very unpopular to the electorate, and governments have found this out to their cost. A PPP project may be viewed as a dangerous step towards privatisation. This is particularly true of utilities like water and even electricity or power, that the electorate, the public, may consider that these are things which are not to be put in private sector control. Some of the potential disadvantages of PPP projects are also potential risks. A private sector company may fold. It may be taken over and the new principal, the new owner of the company, may be more difficult to deal with. They may wish to renege on certain conditions that have been stipulated in the PPP agreement. So this is a risk for the government. On the other hand, there are risks for a company. A change of government may lead to a change in PPP policy. There may be a potential cessation of a project or change in its dimension. So this is a risk to a company and also a risk to the financing institutions that back the company in the implementation of the project. Financial targets may not be achieved. There may be a project overrun or a budget overrun, and that may lead to strict penalties from the financing institutions. Where does that burden lie? Does it lie with the company, or does it lie with the government department? Who is responsible for those delays or the non-achievement of the financial targets? Another risk, and this has been seen in the implementation of a number of PPP projects, is that when you look at government departments, public sector departments, there are a number of levels of management and a number of levels of operations. So, for example, there may be a project involving the development of a road system, which can involve senior levels of a national ministry. It may also involve various levels within a state or local authority or municipal authority, and not all levels may understand the framework of a PPP project and how it should be implemented. This has proved to be a very substantial hazard, particularly for the private sector and of course for the government budget in the development and implementation of PPP projects. There are some important principles that must be noted in terms of understanding PPP. And unfortunately, in the early implementation of PPP projects, these principles were not really recognized. One very important principle is that a project does not become affordable just because PPP is used. It was thought incorrectly that a large development project, perhaps the development of new power stations or the development of railway network, was unaffordable by the government. In some projects it may be a state or local government that cannot afford the required infrastructure development, and mistakenly they think that we'll bring in a private sector partner, private sector financing, and therefore the project becomes affordable. This is an incorrect assumption and has been the cause of the failure of a number of projects, and even the fact that some projects didn't even get off the ground. Another mistake is that, a mistaken principle, is that a project does not become more efficient simply because PPP is used. The project has to be designed in the correct way. As I've mentioned earlier, risk has to be allocated to the party most able to take on that risk, and the design and implementation of the project has to be done in a way that will actually work. So simply by saying, oh, we'll do the project by PPP does not mean that the project is more efficient or more effective, or even that it will cost less. So this brings us on to that point that we've mentioned earlier, that risk should be allocated to the party best able to manage that risk. Now, when projects were implemented simply by the traditional procurement route by government departments, then the government department or the government decides they will develop a new rail network, or they'll develop new highways, or they'll develop more ports or airports, or whatever the area of infrastructure is. Then a certain budget is allocated to that from the national purse, and then procurement involves taking on private sector organisations to execute certain parts of the project, but the project is still owned by the government. There, of course, have been many mistakes made in the traditional procurement model. When a project is developed and implemented through a PPP model, then there will be at least two parties. There will be the government department and a private sector company. In reality, and this will be the case the more complex the project is, there will be more parties involved. So there may be a main contractor and there may be subcontractors. So for example, in the highway project, you may have the main contractor company responsible for building the road. They will have subcontractors who are responsible for the electricity supply, for lighting along the highway, perhaps a separate subcontractor for the drainage systems, other subcontractors responsible for other elements of the development of the project. There will be financing organisations, the funding of the project. And so in designing the project and looking at how it is best implemented, then all parties need to come together and agree, and it has to be a legal agreement, who will be taking on which risk. So, for example, between the contractor, the main contractor, and the subcontractor responsible for installing the electric systems, if there's some fault and mismanagement of the relationship between laying the road and laying the electric systems, then who's responsible for that? This can become very, very complex and legally can become very difficult to manage. But in principle, at least, we see that this overriding principle that risk should be allocated to the party that is best able to manage that risk. And I used the example earlier on that in the development of a highway, the government department, the Highways Ministry, will take on the responsibility and therefore the risk of acquiring land, negotiating with local authorities and landowners. That is its responsibility and its risk, whereas the contractor will take on the responsibilities and therefore the risks for surveying the route that the highway has to take, making sure that the route it is actually an implementable project, which type of surface should be laid, the various interfaces between the highway and local roads, the design of that, safety elements and so forth. So the responsibilities and therefore the risks of those elements are taken on by the private sector company. One of the biggest challenges in developing infrastructure is the ever-increasing cost of projects. Governments always have to question themselves as to whether they can afford the necessary development of infrastructure. And as PPP projects developed, a very common mistake was made that if the government couldn't afford projects, bringing in the private sector would automatically make the projects affordable. And to their cost, a number of governments found that this was a very incorrect assumption. A project has to be viable. Bringing in the private sector brings in the advantages and the benefits that we've spoken about, but each project has to be weighed up on its own merits, the design of the project, the way the project is going to be developed, implemented and operated, all have to be considered very carefully. And this is far away from just a simple assumption that bringing in a private sector company and private sector finance will make the project affordable. The amount of money required is very large. In India, for example, during a 5-year period, it's calculated that an amount equivalent to about $1 trillion is required to execute all of the necessary infrastructure across all sectors. But the government itself can only afford between, let's say, 1/3 and 1/2 of that amount, and therefore it is necessary to bring in external parties, private sector, both national and international players, in order to be able to develop those projects. One of the biggest challenges facing governments and the private sector in developing all sectors of infrastructure, it is what is known as the implementation capability gap. In other words, the parties involved do not have the capabilities, the capacity to design, develop, implement and operate the projects. every successive year sees advances in technology, advances in engineering, advances in management practice, and advances in design. And all the parties involved in the development of any substantial project have to be completely up to date, if not ahead of, these developments in the way that projects are designed and executed. Furthermore, there's often a very big gap in capability between public sector organisations, government ministries and agencies, and the private sector counterparts who are brought in as partners for the PPP projects. And this mismatch is crucial and has led in many cases to projects not being designed or not being executed properly. So there may be an inability to plan effectively for project delivery. The public sector and private sector partners may have very different concepts of what is necessary, a lack of efficiency in the delivery of the project, and a lack of confidence from international partners and sources of funding if they see that the capability is lacking. When we examine this more closely, we find that the gap in implementation capability exists at all levels. We've seen that it exists between the private sector and the public sector. It also exists between international partners and national participants in projects. For example, there may be an international engineering company or international consultancy company involved in a project, and they may have very different levels of experience and competence compared to the national participants and partners that they are working with. If we look at the hierarchy within a country, there'll also be an implementation capability gap between the national participants and those at state, local level. Municipal authorities and state governments will, generally speaking, not be able to match the level of capability and competence that is seen at a national level. And as we've seen, a gap between the abilities in the public sector and the private sector. It's important to find effective solutions to bridge or fill the implementation capability gap or the lack of competence in implementing projects. Capacity building programs are vital at every level and for all the parties and partners involved in a project. There must be complete congruence in the implementation capability amongst all the parties, otherwise, almost inevitably, projects will fail or not live up to expectations. Now, there's a very interesting concept that must be borne in mind here, which is that, let's say you have an engineering company that is skilled and experienced in manufacturing highways, roads, bridges in the UK or in Canada or Australia, and they are engaged as a private sector partner for a road building project in a mountainous region in India. They will have to integrate their understanding of best practice as they have been using it in their own environment and adapt it to the local conditions of the area where they are now going to be constructing a new road. Those conditions will be very different, and so the understanding that they have of the best way of constructing a highway to create best durability, best quality, they will have to adapt that by working with the local partners in order to make sure that they can deliver the project in that local environment. And for this reason and for other reasons, the capacity building programs that are introduced must be comprehensive, they must be all-inclusive, they must embrace the senior and middle levels of management, all levels of management. They must involve all the levels of technical capability from the senior levels through to all the other levels of skills in one organisation, for example, the private sector company that is executing the project, and match that with the understanding and competence in the other parties and other partners in the project, including the public sector partner. Now we're going to consider the spectrum of private sector participation, PSP. You will see from the illustration this ranges from a public utility right through to privatization. So one extreme, the government owns and operates and has complete responsibility for that entity. At the other end of the spectrum, the government has handed over all responsibility and all functions to the private sector, to a company. So let's look at these in more detail. So first of all, we have a public utility in which there is no private sector participation, apart from the fact that the government body, the government utility, will procure materials and services from private suppliers for which they'll be paid. But the private sector entity has no further involvement. And the government body, the utility, manages the operations, maintenance, procurement and investment. And generally speaking, all of the funding and investment will come from government. In the first stage of involving the private sector, operations and maintenance are outsourced to a private sector organisation, to a company. So the company will be responsible for operating that entity and for maintaining it, and it will be given various performance incentives. The better it performs, the more rewards it will receive. The next stage on is that more responsibility is given to the private sector. The operations are not only run by but managed by a third party, by a private sector company. And generally speaking, they will also be given further incentives for innovation, for capacity building, and for the efficiency of the operations. Next along is leasing. So for a certain specified period of time, all the assets and operations for that entity are transferred to the private sector, to a company. They will be given performance incentives for the way that they run that entity. And generally speaking, after that period of time, after the lease has expired, then the asset will be transferred back to the public sector. But we see a factor here, greater risk transfer. We spoke earlier about the fact that one of the advantages of PPP projects is that risk is allocated to the party that is best able to manage that risk. So when an entity is leased to a private sector company, the assumption is that they will be better able to handle the risks involved in operating and maintaining that entity. The next stage in the process, where there is even greater involvement from the private sector, are the categories that are normally termed as PPP, or public-private partnership projects. And there are many forms. I've listed two here: BOOT, which is build, own, operate and transfer, and DBFO, which is design, build, finance and operate. So in these situations, the construction risk and technology risk are transferred to the private sector, to the third party. For example, a PPP project may involve a company designing and building a road. So they will take on the construction risk, they will take on the technology risk. But here we see another factor, is that when a partnership is developed in this way, then because of the greater involvement of the private sector, they also have access to capital markets, to investment from the private sector. So this is the stage at which there's greater access to funding for the projects to give better probability that large infrastructure projects can actually be realized effectively. A further stage is what is known as a concession. This means that there is full outsourcing of an entire business or part of a business to the private sector. So in this case, all staff are transferred, all personnel who are working on the project are transferred to the private sector entity. The concessionaire, the private sector party, will define and implement all of the business plans related to that operation. The final stage is complete privatisation. So the government body or ministry or agency hands over the entire utility permanently to the private sector. An example in the UK is that in England and Wales, water utilities, which previously were owned and operated by government departments, have been handed over completely to the private sector. So the users of the water supply will now be paying a company rather than paying the government. Now, in such a case, with water or other important public utilities, the government will usually insist on wide-ranging and stringently applied regulations. So the company that now operates the water supply for a particular region will be obliged to supply a particular quantity of water at a particular quality. It will also be responsible for the disposal of wastewater according to certain standards. So we've now considered the entire spectrum of private sector participation. There are many fine details. If we look at, for example, at the column that says BOOT and DBFO, there are many nuances. There are many different formats in which the partnership can be formulated. The same with leases, the same with management contracts, the same with concessions. The two extremes, the public utility, complete ownership and operations by a government department, and privatisation, are really the two ends where it's well defined exactly how an entity will be operated. So if we look from left to right, we see that as we move from the public utility to privatisation, then there is increasing private sector participation. And that means that there is increasing transfer of risk from the government, from the public sector, towards the private sector as we move from left to right across the diagram. And if the projects are designed and the contracts and legal requirements are designed properly, it will mean that this principle is applied, that risk will be allocated to the party that is best able to manage that risk. An important principle in the whole concept of developing PPP projects. And if we look at the central part of the diagram, from O&M contracts through to concession, this is the range that is normally defined as public-private partnership. The entire range from public utility to privatisation is the entire PSP spectrum. So you'll see from this that when you say public-private partnership, PPP, it's not one concept. It's a whole range of involvement of the private sector, and within each of these levels, from O&M contracts through to concessions, there are many nuances, many varieties, many variations that will be applied at each level. I'm now going to consider some examples in the India context. Different models will apply for different sectors. We've seen just now the range of the PPP spectrum, and within each segment of that spectrum there will be many different models that could be applied. And what is important, that the type of PPP structure that is developed and implemented for a project is suitable for the sector, it's suitable for the locality, the country, the region, the area of the country in which it's applied, and also it is the best fit for the specific project. So I'm going to take three examples here. I'm going to take roads, highways, I'm going to take urban water supply, and healthcare. If we look at national roads, then it could well be that a toll road model is the best for large, heavily used highways. For example, the highway between Delhi and Jaipur. In this case, the private sector entity involved in the PPP project will have a contract that they will design and build, own and operate the highway for a certain number of years, perhaps 20 years, 25 years. During that period, they will earn revenues from the road users. So this is an example in which the end user is paying directly for the use of that service or entity, and they're paying in proportion to the amount that they use the road. So someone who uses that highway every day, 5 days a week, going to work and returning from work, will pay more than someone who may use the road occasionally. But in other cases, toll roads may not be the best solution. There may be public opposition. It may be unaffordable for local users and therefore not viable as a project. And it may be unenforceable. For example, users may leave the highway at unapproved points, which means that the revenues cannot be collected. So I've listed a few examples. Build, operate, transfer, BOT. Build, own, operate, transfer, BOOT, design, build, finance, operate, DBFO. And if you do some reading and some research, you'll find that there are many other examples of the particular models in which PPP projects can be designed and implemented. And these varieties have been introduced because there is a need, there is a requirement for finding the best model, the best fit for a particular project. And so it can be that a highway in the north of India between Delhi and Jaipur may have very different requirements from a highway that may be built in another part of the country. In cases where a toll road solution is not the best or not the optimum solution, then the private sector partner has to be paid through one or more other modalities. Through tax revenues, through donor funding, this means international organisations, or through loans, for example, which are paid off over a period of time by the government. The next example I'll take is water supply, urban water to large towns or to smaller towns and villages and rural areas. Water supply is regarded as vital for the whole population, and widely regarded as something that is a right. Everybody has the right to access to water, and it should be free. Now, of course, it isn't free. There's a cost involved in providing water, and that cost traditionally has been borne by the local government authority, and it pays for that by raising taxes. Now, if water supply is carried out through a PPP project of some sort, or the water supply is privatized, then the concept is that the provision of water will become more efficient, more effective, and therefore the cost will be brought down for the public. In other words, water is costing less. Now, how can this be done? In many cases, and this is certainly the case in India, the public will be allergic to any idea that water supply is being put under private control. I've mentioned that in England and Wales, in the UK, the water companies have been privatised. They're subject to stringent regulations, and if they violate those regulations, then the government has the right to take back control of that water authority. Now, interestingly, Scotland has taken a completely different route. The Scottish government and the Scottish people decided that they would not wish to privatise the water supply, water authorities, and they've implemented a different solution, which is to corporatise the public body. In other words, the water authority is owned by, the ownership is retained by the government, in other words, by the people of Scotland, but it functions as a company. Now, this has some very important ramifications. Normally, public bodies, public entities, public utilities operate through an annual budget. So the national government or local authority will decide how much money can be available to spend by the different departments, by the different utilities, and that budget is allocated to that utility. Now, in many cases, there will be an incentive to spend all the money, because if the entire budget is not spent, then there is a likelihood that the government will reduce the amount of money available in the next year, which means that money may not be spent in the wisest and most efficient way. There will also be penalties if the utility or department overspends. Now, private sector organisations, companies, function in a different way. They will function by having a longer term approach. They will have a business plan which spans a number of years, in which the finances have to work, but they don't work in a constricted period of 12-month segments. In other words, there's a longer life cycle implied. And a company is able to bring in investment as long as that investment is wisely used and can be repaid after a certain amount of time. So a corporatized public body has those advantages. It's better able to enter into partnerships with other private sector organizations, and it is better able to seek investment and funding for its operations, and those investments and funding will be available not just for a 12-month period, but over a more intelligent life cycle for the provision of that entity. And in Scotland, this model has worked very well. They found that the efficiency of water supply is better, the quality of water is better, and also the way in which wastewater is taken care of. In fact, the Scottish model for urban water supply, as it's often called, has been so successful that a branch of the Scottish Water Authority, Scottish Water International, has been formed, which has effectively advised and implemented projects in other countries, working with governments in other countries. And the Scottish Water International Authority and Commonwealth infrastructure partners have briefed officials of the Ministry of Urban Development in India and state and municipal representatives on how this model could work in India. The last example we take is healthcare, hospitals, and this is an example of social infrastructure. In the UK, PPP models have been developed for hospitals and other entities within the healthcare system. And various other countries in Europe, Italy, Spain, for example, have based their PPP hospital projects on the UK example. Italy, for example, has used a DBFO model, design, build, finance and operate model for some of its hospital projects. Now, we're looking at social infrastructure rather than economic infrastructure, and there's very different considerations here. So, a PPP model for a hospital will be one in which the public sector, the health authority, maintains control over medically and politically sensitive health services and is protected from the financial risk of the operation. So that's very important, that all of the issues regarding healthcare, medical issues, politically sensitive issues, these are taken care of by the health authority. So those risks are taken care of by the health authority. The private sector entity, on the other hand, is responsible for the finances, that is the finances of the operations of the hospital, not the medical expenses, and for the physical operations. So construction, facility maintenance and management, those operations and risks are taken care of by the company, the private sector, but it's protected from clinical risk. So all of the medical and clinical issues are taken care of by the public sector, and the private sector company is completely protected from those risks. We've seen that the introduction of PPP models for economic and social infrastructure projects can have significant and substantial benefits and advantages. There are potential disadvantages and risks, and these can be and should be mitigated by the careful design and implementation of the project, and making sure that the PPP model is that which is best suited to the specific requirements of the project.